Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our SBIA workshop on complex generics. I'm Robert Lionberger, and I'm the director of the Office of Research and Standards in the Office of Generic Drugs. I'm going to give an update on our GDUFA science and research activities that are relevant to generic drugs. To begin with, I want to remind you why science and research is so important to FDA's mission. FDA makes sure that generic and brand drugs are equivalent. Right? This means that they have the same active ingredient, they have the same action in the body. And this is the key focus of our scientific talks today. How do we ensure that the drugs are delivered to the same site of action? As well as you'll hear a lot from our Office of Pharmaceutical Quality colleagues today to talk about how generic products have to meet the same high quality standards as the brand products. So that's FDA's interest in the science. It's critical to our mission. But from the perspective of you, the generic drug manufacturers, the science is also critically important because of the great value that the products that you produce create for the American public and patients across the world. When there's generic drugs available, there's more treatment choices, there's more competition. This can make drug supply and access more robust to supply chain interruptions and reduce the impact of drug shortages on public health. From your perspective as generic drug developers, the scientific foundation that leads to more competition is more access, more opportunities to develop and compete in the marketplace. We hope that that's your real contribution to this activity. The resulting benefit of this additional competition and your efforts to establish business and products in this area is lower costs for the public that use these generic drug products. But all of these things are not going to happen unless we spend the time and effort on the science and research and the foundations for our generic drug program that enable this. This is especially true for the complex products you heard the commissioner just talk about. If you want to have all of these benefits, new markets for your products, new choices for the American public, you've got to address those scientific challenges directly. And that's why we're here for this two-day workshop, really to be as clear as possible about what those challenges are and how we at FDA have been acting to address them through our science and research programs, and taking those science and research results and communicating through the various regulatory processes where you interact with us around complex products and complicated issues in generic drug development. And this gets to the really important impact of the GDUFA research program. This program helps the development of more generic competition, especially in areas where the bioequivalence evaluation is scientifically challenging. If there's no approach forward, or not even no clear approach forward, then the sort of entire generic drug system starts to slow down, right? The reason generic products are cheaper and more competitive is that there are clearly defined pathways that lead toward equivalent products. And it's the job of this research program to really bring out that clarity in places where it's much more challenging. So it's incredibly important what we're doing here. And as running the FDA's research program on generic drugs, we also have this focus on really broadly making generic drug development and review more efficient. So as a leader of our research program, we really see we have two key customers. One is you, the generic drug developers, right? What are the things that we can do that can really focus you on? Here's the most efficient pathway to show my product is the same as the brand product and going to have the same effect in patients when it's dosed to them and substituted from them in real-world use. As well as our second customer is our FDA review and assessment staff. Right. The scientific advances here can help them make better and faster decisions about your applications that come in, especially in situations where those issues become very complicated. There's lots of uncertainty, maybe alternatives to different guidances. There may be no guidance available. Those are the places where the science and research program supported by the GDUFA has its most significant impacts. And hopefully through these next 2 days, you'll get a very deep sense of what that is and get into some of those value creation points for both FDA and the generic drug industry. I want to talk a little bit about how the whole system works together toward this goal of providing access to more complex generics. So this is my slide that talks about the integrated PreADA system, how things work together over time. And so it begins with any kind of research program. The first thing you have to do is think about, what research am I going to conduct? And so this is a planning stage. And so every year we have a public workshop. We had it in May this year as a virtual workshop, one of FDA's first virtual workshops due to the interruption of in-person events. But we do that process. That's where we try to hear from you, the industry, as well as other stakeholders, as to what those scientific gaps are. So certainly we think about them internally, and we hope that we have a good idea about them. But we always want to give you, the industry, an opportunity to participate in this process, to help us understand what's exceptionally difficult for you, what types of studies are blocking you getting into certain generic drug markets. The more you tell us about this, the more we can target and direct our research program toward addressing those challenges. So we also look at what we call the complex product inventory. So this is looking at, what are all the potential reference products that are available? Are they on the market? What are the different market sizes of those products? Do they have generic drug competition? So we pay very close attention to this type of data. And internally, FDA, we're using this more and more for planning purposes, looking at saying, from this type of information, can we use predictive models to think what would happen in the future? When will generic products be expected to come into the market? So this really helps us target on future competition opportunities. So again, this is all generally public knowledge. Reference products that are approved are public knowledge, what their sales are, whether that are on the market. All of this data is really available publicly from different sources, but we also integrate it and think about that in terms of developing research plans. So once we have research plans, you'll generally hear about our priorities in the fall. So we have this public workshop in May. Sometime in the fall, we'll be releasing our new priorities for FY21 based on what we heard from that meeting and our sort of analysis of the current environment. So then we go into the mode of what FDA is doing is we're executing this research. So you can follow along on our GDUFA webpage, where you see what grants or contracts are out for competition, what ones were awarded. We also do research internally, working with our FDA labs, especially our lab in OPQ. We also have a significant internal work where we look at modeling and data analysis. Since we do some human subject research, we also have some human subject research oversight there. So we're dealing with some of the same challenges you are in keeping the in vivo studies and restarting in vivo studies that may be interrupted by different types of COVID-19 related activities across the world. So we're involved in research execution. Once, as that research comes to completion, my office is called the Office of Research and Standards. So the thing that we're creating from the research are really sort of in the informal sense standards. What should you do to create a generic of a particular product? And so one of the key ways you see these research outcomes is you see them flowing into product-specific guidances. Every year, you see new product-specific guidances on complex products. This is only possible because of this research pipeline. You don't get 50 new guidances, 50 or more new guidances on complex products each year without this research program in place, identifying and driving on the scientific challenges. As well, the product-specific guidances, when we revise them. I know that sometimes industry gets nervous when we say a product-specific guidance is revised. But last year, there were 30 product-specific guidance revisions that led to more efficient, more streamlined bioequivalence recommendations, generally for complex products. These are replacements of clinical endpoint studies with in vitro options or addition of in vitro options to guidances. A lot of times we do like to add options to guidances. That gives you more flexibility, and so it doesn't say the old method is out of date. It just says there's a new option available. So again, be careful if you complain about revisions to guidances, because a lot of these more efficient methods are revisions of previous methods that don't have those options. So we want you to continue to support both new product-specific guidances and revisions and see the value of them. As well as sometimes these new approaches require new ways of analyzing studies or new analytical methods. these new tools and approaches are also outcomes of our research program, and sometimes you'll read about them in publications, and then things that you might be to think about integrating into your development program. And so as we create these and communicate these, another key place where you see this impact is through pre-ANDA meetings. Last year we got about 100 pre-ANDA meeting requests coming in, mostly on complex products. For all of those, when you have this research pipeline feeding those pre-ANDA meetings, you have a much richer experience at those pre-ANDA meetings. You get the benefit of this experience. You're talking to people who have experience working on the scientific challenges relevant to the product that you're talking about, and you'll get focused, on-point, practical advice about your development program. The pre-ANDA meetings are also a place where you, the industry, can move forward alternatives to our product-specific guidances. So if you want to do something different than a guidance, you have a meeting that gets a priority for that. Those are one of the things we value in the GDUFA 2 negotiations, where we'll say we'll meet with you if you propose an alternative. We want to encourage innovation and give you feedback on innovation approaches if you're able to move faster than things show up in product-specific guidances. We also try to communicate these activities to, again, I mentioned our 2 key customers, the industry, through different workshops, as well as we do training for our reviewers inside FDA so that they understand what these scientific advances will mean, if there's a new analytical method or new type of study. In the topical area, see a lot more applications containing IVPT and IVRT studies. There's been a lot of internal training so that our reviewers are prepared to assess those products. And then finally, as we get closer to our goal, right, there's been advice, there's been pre-NDA meetings, but at the end, to get these benefits, you, the industry, have to submit applications. FDA has to evaluate them. Sometimes those evaluations, when there's something new or a complex product we haven't seen before, that feeds back, and those people who've been working in the research are consulted in the ANDA review process. Again, the information flows through the system, and then at the end, the research impacts our assessment, our application assessment decision. So research is very closely integrated into the entire system. But again, as our program was developing, first we started out really focusing on the research, then you started to see interactions and product-specific guidances, more guidances coming through. Now you have a pre-NDA meeting program in GDUFA 2, but really now we've reached the point where a lot of these things are beginning to move through, and so we're really focused on how do you also move your things through the review process. So a lot of the talks at today's workshop are going to be focused on practical advice on what should you put in your application and how our reviewers look at that, because that's what gets to the final goal that we're all talking about in those beginning slides: increased access to generic competition. You've got to have approved products. That's essential to your business, and it's essential to the value creation for the American public. So I want to give you a sense of the scale of our research activities that are supposed, I think it's really important that the GDUFA program provide the stable investment for our research activities. This says that these generic drug activities will be a priority for CDER. They'll continue at a stable level. They won't be subject to, this is the most important thing I have to work on this year, but something else drives it off. It allows us continuous, sustained progress to this. That is the foundation for everything you see in the guidances and the pre-NDA meetings about complex products. And so we get a lot of input into this. You see certainly lots of publications in places through both peer-reviewed presentations and publications. You can find links to all of these on our website where it can help you track them down and find out what they are. But there's a huge volume of work. We try to be as transparent as possible. We provide a large number of workshops where we bring together sometimes our external collaborators as well as people within FDA who are working on this to provide updates and answer questions about that. And again, you really see the outcomes of this research program through our product-specific guidances. So speaking of the product-specific guidances, just a reminder of the scale of activity that you see. Almost 2,000 available now. Again, because of the GDUFA support, stable quarterly postings. The GDUFA commitments help align everyone in FDA around meeting these goals and providing these guidances. Over the last few years, about 250 guidances each year, about 100 of them new, and a big chunk for complex products on these products. And again, revisions. But some key trends about our product-specific guidances. Again, increase in activity for the complex products. As I mentioned before, newer revised PSGs with more efficient BE approaches. but it's, there's a lot of PhDs out there, so we do spend a lot of effort maintaining them and keeping them up to date. We expect that the guidances will reflect FDA's current thinking. So when we advance in a certain area, sometimes we have to do big chunks of revisions to keep these PhDs up to date. But we want these PhDs to be the place that you go to get the most accurate, up-to-date information, and we want them to be reliable and something that you can use to give you clarity in your generic drug development, but you all want to make sure that they provide the most up-to-date information. And again, just in the key trend there, we're producing a lot of complex product guidances even though there's no goals for them. So again, this is part of the overall value of the generic drug program. Again, another key place that you see outcomes and complex product questions come through is our control correspondence system. So these are the written questions that we get about generic drug development. These are increasing at a very high rate. If you look at up to, a few days ago when I recorded this presentation, there are 3,400, so exceeding last year. My estimate will hit about 3,600 by the end of the month. But these control correspondences, about 40% of them are about complex products. That's where industry seems to have a lot of the questions about future development. So if we look at what's trending, that's what we see. A lot of interest in complex products. 7% of these controls are the more complicated questions with longer goal dates. These require some sort of clinical input usually. Again, very high scale system that gets you quick 60-day answers to your development questions, fed by, and a lot of them touch on these complex products. For our pre-ANDA meetings, again, this was new feature of GDUFA 2, and so you see in that first year of GDUFA 2, really quick uptake of the program, moving up to about 100 meetings. We had 100 meetings last fiscal year. We had more than 100 meetings this fiscal year as well. Might still have few more come in before the end of the fiscal year. And again, so you see this growth. We're meeting all of our goals related to this. We're, far exceeding our 90% targeting for getting you a decision very quickly. This last year, we moved to a 14-day decision point. So that means you get a meeting yes or no decision within 14 days. Our staff worked really hard to meet that. That was a big shift from those first 2 years where we had a little bit longer time. So we are quickly and accurately deciding that you get the meeting, and we're scheduling the meetings, hitting them on time at a very high level. And then again, key place where these link into the science and research activities is if you want to discuss innovative approaches, then come and talk to us through the pre-ANDA meeting process. And again, just thinking about overall scale of this activity, if you think of the scale at which we spend on research, the cost of our research program, about $25 million a year. The sales of these products without generic competition, still billions of dollars per year, complex products without generic competition. This is an opportunity, but this is also the place where that key generic drug program goal of access, we really need some effort on the science part, and then the translation of those scientific advances and scientific advice into actual ANDA submissions and efficient and quick assessment of those processes. So there's a huge opportunity for leverage here. The small investments on the scientific foundations can really move huge amounts of benefit to the American public and the patients that use generic products. And so I want to give a little bit of an example of some of the priorities we've identified in the past for our generic drug development. You can go to our website and see these. Expanding our characterization-based BE methods for topical products, for ophthalmic products, providing alternatives to the clinical endpoint studies for inhalation products and nasal products. Again, these have been on our priority list for many years, but we've been very successful for these routes. There are scientifically sound alternatives to the comparative studies that are generally applicable in all of these areas. So this has been a huge success for our program. You're beginning to see these in our product-specific guidances and general guidances, and we see lots of discussions in pre-NDA meetings. So you see product-specific guidances for topical products, ophthalmic products that have in vitro-only approaches. You have some beginning to see inhalation guidances that have alternatives for some of the products to the clinical endpoint parts of the weight of evidence approach. They still have in vitro studies involved, but much more efficient approaches that you see. And in the nasal products, you see guidances that point you to some of the advanced characterization methods on particle sizing and identification of not just what the size of the particle is, but the chemical identity of those products that really help solve some tricky bioequivalence products for the nasal spray suspension products. So you're seeing these. So in all of these areas, research investment has been very successful. It's moved the bar. It's provided these approaches. As we're seeing these currently, you'll see them propagating through the product-specific guidances. But if you want to move quickly on these, also through the pre-NDA meetings and getting feedback on new approaches as we move forward in all of these areas. Certainly, we still have work to do in this area. It's not that we're going to stop working in any of these areas, because some of the challenges that you'll see if you look at our guidances, some of the alternatives are limited to very similar formulations. So we might want to do, sometimes there's limitations to how Q1, Q2 similar you can be. More flexibility may lead to faster competition. So we're looking to places where we can expand the range of the in vitro and more efficient approaches to formulations that might have smaller, well-defined differences. Some of the details of implementations need to be worked out precisely. What are the best analytical tools in certain cases? What are the most appropriate acceptance limits? We're using a lot of PBPK modeling to help us make these decisions, right? To understand, for example, how close does particle size have to be before it begins to affect bioavailability? How close does viscosity have to be before it affects drug delivery and absorption rates for different semi-solid formulations? We use a lot of mechanistic modeling approaches to help us build out the details of these implementations. And so we can continue to do research on implementing these methods and moving them forward, expanding them to different product categories. Still in some of these areas, there's some products where there's something that's hard to measure, or there's some higher risk that we need to investigate and move forward. But fundamentally, we've really shifted the bar on the complex routes of delivery and changed this focus from we need new methods to how do we implement the new methods and work through them. And so again, as I said before, the huge benefit to the American public depends on successful ANDAs being submitted. So if you look at this slide here, which shows how much the price to consumers decreases as a function of generic competition, right? When you have limited competition, there's not as much savings for the American public, especially, here the example of maybe a topical dermatological product with clinical endpoint studies that may cost tens of millions of dollars to conduct. Maybe if that's the only approach, there may not be that many companies that can provide that. There won't be shifts in this curve. If you look back at one of the very first in vitro options that we ever provided, this is the acyclovir ointment PSG in 2012 that provided an in vitro BE option for a topical product. We've gotten many ANDA submissions for these products. We have 13 approved ANDAs. Really a significant shift in the topical environment where it used to be maybe you saw one generic, maybe no generics because the market didn't support the investment. When you have more efficient BE methods, lots more competition can come through. And so this is the oldest product, so you see this tail here. Many other products are moving along in this direction as our PSGs. We have more and more PSGs on the topical products providing these in vitro options. So this is just an example of what the future may look like as we continue the science and research successes. And so what are the keys to success for complex generic products? How do I get my products, through, not just develop them, but get them through the application process successfully? And so the first thing is really to understand why the RLD is complex. What's the challenge in this? What's difficult about it? Is it the local delivery? Is there something about the formulation that's very unique and hard to match? So you have to really dig into both the product and the patient population when it's used. And then once you've identified those challenges, really pay attention to the science and research program. What are the approaches that I can use to measure, calculate, predict, model that complex aspect of the product to help me design an equivalent product? And so integrating these new scientific approaches into your development programs, so you're up to date with what's available, what can be done, the tools that can do it, the models that can help direct your studies most efficiently. And then, what we've noticed broadly is that as these complex generics move through the system, you start seeing lots of challenges of the interactions between our regulatory landscape and the new scientific advances. So this can be tricky to navigate. You have to pay attention to our guidances. The citizen petitions are a place where we direct people who said, well, I don't agree with what this new approach is. So you have to be, you have to understand that that's part of the regulatory and competitive landscape. That it's not, people aren't going to just say, well, go ahead, make that cheaper generic. There may be attempts to block competition through the use of citizen petition processes. Many times citizen petitions do raise substantive scientific issues. So you have to be aware of that. FDA will look at those. If you see that, maybe you can understand, well, in a second, because I did part A and B, I understand the RLD and the new science. What they're asking in that citizen petition, it's not going to affect my product. I can also, be part of the public discussion around the citizen petition process if I'm prepared for that and proactive in that. Again, sometimes, complex products, they also have the same challenges other ANDAs have. So you have to be cautious of all of the other things that are going on in the changes in the regulations. Again, for combination products over the past few years, there's been some significant changes there. We have our second combination product workshop in October, co-sponsored with DIA, that will really talk about some of these changes for moving generic products through the generic combination products through the regulatory landscape. The pre-ANDA program is an important place to get feedback, especially if you're doing something at the leading edge, you're ahead of where the guidances are, or there's a guidance and you're following it, but there's some very challenging implementation parts, get a lot of feedback. And again, continue to monitor changes in the RLD and the landscape during the ANDA review. Someone might submit a citizen petition, RLD product might change their label. Sometimes even some of the simpler issues can take a long time to resolve. For example, there are products that by our regulations, they have to be Q1 and Q2 to the brand product. This is true whether they're a simple product or a complex product, but some of those can be challenging. Some of the simpler issues can be very challenging to develop, and so you have to make sure that you get all of those issues right to move the complex generics across the line. And especially if you're the first generic for a very complex product, these issues are going to be magnified, and there's going to be lots of focus and attention on that product as you're moving that first product toward approval. So a lot of challenges to move toward success. I think within FDA, we recognize these challenges. We're committed to our own internal process improvements to make the pathway to complex generics and our assessment more efficient and more effective as well. And along these lines of, expanding access to complex generics, I want to announce a recent award of what we call a Center for Research on Complex Generics. This is part of our research program. So this is a 5-year, $5 million grant to the University of Maryland and the University of Michigan. They've already seized the complexgenerics.org web address, so you can go there to get more information about this new center. But what's new about this center and what its focus is intended to be is enhancing our collaboration with the generic drug industry. So there's going to be, through this center, a lot more industry collaborations, opportunities for industry to be involved in our research activities, training on uptake of complex methods for complex products, new analytical methods. We also hope to leverage industry's expertise through this center, through the development of products, testing of analytical methods. The goal of the center is to really facilitate collaborative work between FDA and industry to facilitate the overall mission of the program. So we're very excited about this. This was just recently awarded over the summer. They're just beginning to get started. If you go to their website, there's ways you can get engaged. They're reaching out to various stakeholders to get input on what the key challenges to industry are. So this is just another place where we're really focusing our research efforts on providing assistance to developers of complex generics to help increase access to those important generic products. I want to turn a little bit to a challenge that everyone in the world has been facing, and this is our response to COVID-19. And just to sort of remind you that the generic drug program, we've been prioritizing and expediting the review of any generic drugs that are used to treat COVID-19 or its symptoms. So we've had products that have been approved in only a 3-month approval time from submission for some of the priority products. There's a few complex products that have been used for treatment of different symptoms, some of the albuterol, propofol, emulsions. Those complex product reviews have also been accelerated as well across FDA. We know that COVID-19 can have interrupted our supply chains. There's expedited review of supplements to address potential drug shortages. So a significant amount of effort across the generic drug program in expediting the reviews of generic products that are relevant to COVID-19 or its symptoms. So this is an important part that all of the staff in the Office of Generic Drugs and the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality who work on generic drugs have been engaged in over the last few months. And so, we've been aggressively moving in this area. There's another aspect where COVID-19 affects generic drug development, and this can be its impact really on all development programs. It can impact, in many cases, there are studies that are interrupted by the presence or shutdowns of the local environment in the local communities where you're conducting bioequivalence studies. A lot of the timelines have been interrupted. From my office, we are sponsors for some clinical research. Our in vivo clinical research programs have been significantly interrupted by this. We've had, some of our collaborative laboratories have had to slow down activities. Some of our FDA laboratories have had to reduce the scale of their operations as well. So these activities affect all of our activities. But one thing we've noted is that some of our science and research activities, especially our modeling and simulation approaches, have informed ways we can adapt the generic drug system to understand and provide corrections to some of these potential interruptions. And so some examples. So these are things that you as a developer might have happened, right? My study was halted in the middle and my clinical trials material expired. Or my dropout rate might be much higher and I want to switch to an adaptive design in the middle of my study. Some of my subjects might have missed PK sampling points, but I want to try to use those data. I want to alter my study design to minimize subject visits. A lot of the modeling and simulation approaches supported by GDUFA research can really help us assess these proposed changes and determine that they would be appropriate and acceptable and would not change the scientific validity of the study result. I think, and FDA is much more flexible and open to consider sort of adaptations to protocols, like some of the adaptive design. If you want to add that into a study, that might be something that you might want to consider doing to add more flexibility if you think you might have a different dropout rate. So there's lots of novel study designs and approaches that can be used in these different situations. And we have some tools that allow us to help assess whether these affect the scientific validity of the conclusions. And so we encourage generic applicants to use the control correspondence to ask these type of questions about interruptions to the development programs. We're expediting our responses, and we're open to novel approaches to maintain the product development pipeline, right? Remember, the goal of our program is access to generic products. If the generic drug development system gets bogged down, jammed up, then we're not providing that access. So going beyond the generic products used to treat COVID-19 and its symptoms, we have an important public health need to keep the generic drug pipeline working and supplying the generic drugs that the entire healthcare system needs. And the modeling and simulation approaches are really critical for helping us analyze, what if I change my study design like this? What if I switch batches in the middle of my study? What's the risk? What's the what's the impact on the scientific validity? They're a key way to provide supporting evidence for that. We use them extensively internally. So I encourage you to be familiar with those as a way to sort of assess, what change should I make to my protocol to maintain its scientific validity? So now switching a little bit to talk about the future. As we look going forward, About 30% of the reference listed products that are in the Orange Book in the environment are for complex products. Last year, about 12% of our approved ANDAs were for complex products. So there's still a gap there. There's still the opportunity. Again, the goal is to keep the complex products moving through the system. Pay attention to the research, use that research to keep our product-specific guidances up to date, use the pre-NDA meeting process, and then follow that up with submissions and their ANDA submissions and their assessment. So again, that's the important aspect, but there's still this gap here between the complex products that are out there and the ANDAs that are approved. So once we reach equal number of complex products approvals as the complex products RLDs, then we'll be finished, but we still have a long way to go before we get there. And the science and research programs in the GDUFA program are really focused on reducing that gap in the long term. And, the brand products, this is, I think, the beauty of the system. Competition forces them to keep moving, keep developing innovative new products. They get more and more complicated. And so here are just two pictures of soft mist inhalers, different type of nasal implants. There's a wide range of new products that are coming through that are adding complexity. We see more drug device combination products as well. And so the future environment, again, we likely will see more complex products, more interest in and then that means more future interest in developing generic versions of these products. And we try to make sure that our research projects have focus on the challenges for these new areas and emerging areas going forward. So just to conclude, the pre-ANDA program provides clarity and improves development efficiencies, but it really, for the complex products, in order for the system to work well, it's that research foundation that we're doing the science to get the right answer, to make our processes more efficient, to make them grounded in sound science going forward, to provide efficient development approaches for generic products. And again, one of the exciting parts of working in here is that the pre-ANDA interactions, especially our pre-ANDA meetings, they can support really innovative approaches. You don't have to wait for FDA's guidance to say this is okay. The science is there. It's driving things forward. You can move faster by engaging with the pre-ANDA program. Our guidances, in one sense, our guidances tell us, when we have a lot of clarity around that. But before we have clarity, there's opportunity. And so I encourage you to take advantage of that by engaging with the whole breadth of the pre-ANDA program and looking at both our guidances and our pre-ANDA meeting process and our control correspondence process. So thank you all very much, and be happy to answer a few of your questions now.
Thank you so much, Dr. presentation and taking time to answer questions today. It's a great overview and future state. So the first question is there a time frame for PSG for complex products post-approval of the innovator? For example, for a non-complex product, the corresponding PSG published within 2 years from the lawful date of submission of the generic applicant.
Hi, this is Bob. Thanks for that question. If you look at the GDUFA 2 commitment letter, it indicates that there are commitments for the timeline for product-specific guidance availability, as the questioner asked, only for the non-complex NMEs. So this, again, is part of what the industry and FDA negotiate through the commitment letter. So we did not, in GDUFA 2, negotiate any commitment around the time frame for complex products. If this is something that's valuable to the industry, industry can raise that during the GDUFA 3 negotiation processes. So it's the commitments are what we negotiate between the FDA and industry through the process. That being said, even though there's no commitments, we diligently produce product-specific guidances for complex products because of the great value that they had, and as you saw in my understanding of how the research system works, we do them as we identify new scientific advances. So we use them, but there's not a high degree of certainty about when they'll appear at the level of the commitment. But that's part of the negotiation process that's beginning now.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And our next question, FDA grant pre-ADA meetings for...
So for many of you, you've engaged in the pre-ADA meeting process. And if you read our guidance carefully, you'll see that there's two cases where you can submit a pre-ADA meeting request for complex product. One is the case where there is not a guidance. So I think the question is familiar with that. But the process for the pre-ADA meetings as we negotiated in GDUFA 2 says, if there is a product-specific guidance, you can still request a pre-ADA meeting if you are proposing an alternative to that guidance. So I think this is a really powerful part of the GDUFA 2 program. It really helps drive innovation. So it says, you're not stuck with what FDA put in our guidance, right? If you think there's a better way or a newer approach, sometimes we get questions where, oh, in another product-specific guidance on a related product, you see some new approach and you say, well, can we use this for some other product, but that product-specific guidance has not been updated yet. Again, there's no commitment for the complex product guidances. So this is the outlet through the GDUFA 2 system of getting some information saying, well, can I apply that to a new case? And so this is a place where, I think it's an opportunity for the industry, if you want to do something innovative, to say, I think I have a better way to do that. So certainly, this is up to your own business model. Some companies might say, no, I need more certainty. I want to wait for FDA to update the guidance. We produce a lot of product-specific guidances every year, and we were committed to keeping them up to date. But there might be places where your company might say we want to move forward before there's a guidance that might give us a first mover advantage over some other companies in moving forward an innovative approach. And that's why I think this pre-NDA program can be very valuable at supporting companies that want to take that first step. But there's a little bit more risk. There's a little bit more work, right? If you say, I want to do an alternative to the guidance, we're going to ask you, oh, what's your justification? And you have to bring some data or some analysis or some modeling and simulation, something to the table to support that alternative. But we'll give you definitely, through the meeting process, give you feedback on that alternative approach. And then you can make better decisions about whether you want to pursue that or not. And sometimes we do have guidances set for updates. So you can also look at our PSG page where we provide a list of guidances that will be updated in the next year. So you can look ahead for the complex products and say, oh, is there a guidance revision coming out on this? Likely in the next year is the time frame for that site. So you have some idea of what's moving in those areas.
Great, thank you, Dr. Lionberger. And we have another question about controlled correspondence. We have a question about controlled correspondence. Can that be used for asking scientific advice? And to all of our participants and people listening in, if you have a question for Dr. Lionberger, please put it in the chat pod in the lower right. So again, Dr. Lionberger, can controlled correspondence be used for asking scientific advice?
You again have to read our guidance carefully to understand what types of questions are in scope. Many people use the controlled correspondence process for regulatory questions as well. For example, the most common controlled correspondence question we got is my formulation Q1 and Q2 to the reference product? Is it eligible for submission in that sense? So, is that a scientific or a regulatory question? But especially what we call in GDUFA 2 the complex controlled correspondence. That's not a great name because it's not only about complex products. But though that category that has a little bit longer goal date, those are ones where you can really ask through the controlled correspondence alternative bioequivalence questions about the non-complex products. So say I have a solid oral dosage form and I'm proposing something different. I want scientific input on that alternative approach. That doesn't fit into the negotiated GDUFA 2 pre-NDA meeting process, but it does fit into the complex controlled correspondence process. So there are both regulatory and scientific questions and questions that cover both of those aspects that fit into the controlled correspondence. As you saw from my slides, we're getting close to 4,000 of these questions each year. So it's a very highly used process for the generic industry.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Lionberger. And we have another question. How frequently do the product-specific guidances, how often do they get revised, and what is the basis for revision?
The basis for revision is always that there's some new scientific understanding or advice or some regulatory inconsistency that we need to clarify. So there's always a reason for the revisions. We recently introduced a website that's linked from our product-specific guidance page that describes the upcoming product-specific guidances for complex products. So this is a place you can look at to see what's upcoming. So again, the basis of the revision is there's some new either scientific advance, an alternative approach we want to add to the guidance, or some regulatory consistency that we need to put in. For example, last year we updated all of the product-specific guidances on transdermal systems because we had a new general guidance on the transdermal adhesion studies, and we wanted to make sure that all the PSGs were aligned with that general guidance, that they didn't duplicate information that's in that general guidance, and where the product-specific guidances provided more clarity to the general guidance, that connection was clear. So that's an example of where the regulatory consistency of the guidances might be changed. So all of these are, I think, things that are very valuable. We want the product-specific guidances to be up-to-date, definitive information about product development. And that means they have to change as the environment changes. And so that's why you see revisions. And I mentioned this in my talk, right? What I mean by maintenance is keeping the product-specific guidances up to date. So if you go there, you get the latest information about product development. And we try to be as transparent as possible. Sometimes that's a change that may not be advantageous to the industry. I think most of the changes that we make are focused on the more efficient methods, but there are occasions where, for example, if the brand product changes their label, they add a certain type of information to their label, and that indicates that the generic product also has to be usable according to that label, and that might require new studies to demonstrate that. That's going to be added to the product-specific guidance, and the expectation is that that's the scientific standard for approval. So these things do happen. Some of them are things that are not under FDA's control at all.
Great. Thank you again, Dr. Lionberger. And we have one last question for you. Can you talk a little bit about the Center for Complex Generics and how industry can be involved?
Yeah, so I'm very excited about the Center for Complex Generics that we just awarded. And the thing that it's intended to do that wasn't happening at a high level before was involving industry more actively in the research program. So the Center for Complex Generics, if you go to their website, they have some outreach to the generic industry. They're interested to learn about the priorities of the generic industry. So there'll be some aspects of outreach and scientific communication and workshops that they'll do for industry. But what they're also intended to do is have a place where industry can be more active participants in the research program in an open and transparent way. So it wouldn't just be one company; it would be the entire. It's open for participation across the entire industry in an open and transparent way. So, for example, there might be. We're working on a new analytical method. We know for a complex product, we know that it'll be challenging for companies to implement, but this center could, help facilitate a sort of some implementation training, some samples that might be, that might be sent around to different laboratories to identify whether the method is reproducible, whether additional information is needed. Those are capacities that the industry has that FDA really can't do. We have one or two labs. Industry, each company has their own labs. If people are willing to collaborate in this way, they can leverage that. There might be manufacturing capabilities that the industry can have to produce products to help establish new bioequivalence methods in a collaborative way for the complex generics. There might be multiple companies interested in learning about how you use modeling and simulation methods more effectively for generic drug development, and the center could sort of collaborate with companies that want to have focused training for the industry focus to upgrade their skills and abilities in certain areas of new technologies. So it's something that we haven't had any groups explicitly assigned to do this before. And you see in brand product development some of these collaborative centers as well for like the critical path initiatives, where there's some common things that multiple companies might have some common interest in working together on. So this center is intended to facilitate that, as well as help some of the scientific outreach that FDA wants to do to help communicate all the results of our research activities. So again, the focus of this center is really on collaborative activities with industry. We already have a large research program, so this center is not really intended to sort of do more research. It's to engage the generic industry in the research programs in different ways by having an independent group that can coordinate that directly and transparently. So if you're working with them, FDA will be involved and provide input, but it allows us to manage these industry collaborations in a more transparent way.
Great, thank you so much for the presentation, and that's a very interesting development. So again, thank you for your time and for sharing your expertise with the audience. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Commander Ray Ford to introduce our next speaker.